There we go. Now we have the robot lady voice. Thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful panel, Mapping Queerness, talking about queer space, queer ownership, and what that means for our communities. I'm so pleased to be here today. My name is Anushka Ratnaraja. I'm the Artistic Director of the Vancouver Queer Film Festival, and I am joined here by some amazing, amazing panelists who are going to share their wisdom and experience that they've gained from so many years as really folks who have created so much space for our communities in this city. And I think I will just let them introduce themselves because they can do that much better than I. So I guess I'll just pass the hot seat first to Vanessa Kwan, if you feel like that's all right, and we'll go on from there.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anushka. Thanks for having me today. So yeah, my name is Vanessa Kwan. My pronouns are she and they. Currently I am program director at Grunt Gallery, which is a gallery in Mount Pleasant here, on the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Previously, I worked at a bunch of different arts organizations, I guess, over time, and I come into the arts as an artist first, so I still do have an active arts practice, and yeah, alongside my programming work. And maybe I'll kick it over to Paige.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Anushka. My name is Paige Frewer, and my pronouns are they, them. I got my start in queer space sort of organizing by kind of accident. I started Man Up with a few co-performers and collaborators in 2008. And until the pandemic, we ran basically monthly for what would have been 12 years in March, the first show that we canceled because of COVID. In the last 2 and some odd years, I sort of forayed into a related but new career path, which was running Eastside Studios and founding that with a couple of my close friends as well. And we hold a couple commercial leases in East Vancouver, and out of those buildings, we house art studios for a variety of like mixed practice artists and practitioners and offices. And in our sort of event space, which we prioritize for any like building that we look at, we host parties. So that's where Man Up has existed for the past couple of years. Yeah, that's what I do. How about you, Mel?
Thanks, Paige. Hey, everyone. And also thanks, Anushka, for hosting this and inviting us. My name is Melanie Matining. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am here with you all today, meeting you from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I am currently a business consultant right now with a consulting firm called Equity Inclusion Strategies. But prior to doing that, a lot of my work was centered around queer placemaking. Particularly, I was the community development manager for a queer space called Heartwood Community Cafe, formerly known as Rhizome. And I've also been part of queer organizing, specifically with queer sweaty dance parties, including Denim Fest. And I'm excited to chat with you all today. Yeah, and I guess I'll pass it on to Tin.
Yeah, hey everyone. Thanks, Anushka, for hosting this panel. I'm Tin Lorica. I use they, them pronouns. Currently, I guess I'm still a stand-up comedian, like not so much doing comedy these days. And I'm a poet, and I also co-host and co-produce Millennial Line, which in the before times took place at Redgate. So yeah, Millennial Line. And also, I also co-hosted and also co-produced a show called Yellow Fever at Redgate as well. That's it.
Well, I'm so pleased that you could all join us here today. You're all really brilliant and innovative placemakers for our communities here in Vancouver. And so I'm really excited to see your thoughts, hear your thoughts. It's Tuesday and it's already been a really long week, year, month, everything, who knows. But of course, it's important to ground our conversation on the fact that we are living and working and building community on the unceded, occupied ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh here in colonial Canada. And at Out on Screen, we are experimenting and learning with new ways to do land acknowledgements that go deeper than the ways they have in the past. I know when land acknowledgements were a new thing, they felt probably innovative at the time, but we're invested in figuring out new ways so that it's not a token gesture to acknowledge the occupied lands that we're on. So I'd love to start out our conversation, especially because we're talking about place and space and belonging and community gathering on lands that aren't our own, by talking a little bit about what our relationships to these lands are, how we came to be here, and how we live on them and work on them. And I can start. I was born on these territories. My mom is umpteenth generation settler British Canadian heritage, and grew up on Okanagan territories. My father is an immigrant. He's from Sri Lanka. He's Tamil Sri Lankan, but he grew up in Malaysia. And I grew up on Tsawwassen territories and really didn't know a lot about the territories that I was growing up on, which actually, Paige, you could probably reflect some of those as we grew up in the same town, some of those similar experiences. And really came to understand what it meant to be a settler from different heritages of settling and coming to this place through community organizing with colleagues and friends who are both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and through my university education as well. And I'm constantly learning and constantly re-examining the ways in which I engage with my work on these territories as a settler. And I know that it's complicated and that we're working with a lot of painful histories. And I'm always endeavoring to be as open as possible to those conversations and to moving forward in a good way, because we have to even begin to attempt to undo the tremendous wrongs that have been done to Indigenous peoples on these lands. So that's me as a mixed race person coming to this conversation. I currently live on Musqueam territory, and I'll pass it over to whoever wants to take on this part of the conversation next.
I can go. Hey everyone, as I mentioned, I'm here on the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh. I was born in the Philippines, or what is colonially known as the Philippines, specifically in the Tagalog region. Breaking that down in terms of what that means in Tagalog. Tagalog comes from the term Taga-ilog, which means from the river. So I come from the people of the river. And particularly me and my family come from the islands of Cavite and Marinduque. And so we came to what is colonially known as Canada in 1990 and moved to North Vancouver. Actually, the home that I moved into is right beside the Squamish Reservation. So growing up there, it was both it was something that was never really brought up in terms of growing up as a kid. And I think that that's a really real thing for anyone that's growing up. And I'm glad to see that a lot of education is really shifting around that. when I was a teenager, I moved to Songhees, Lekwungen, and Wasanic territory, which is known colonially as Victoria. And at some point I moved back to Vancouver, where I continue to do my work in organizing. And I think being on this land, especially as a woman of color, but specifically as a light-skinned woman of color, constantly having to think about what it means for me to be living in a place where I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And so thinking about what that means for me in terms of the type of solidarity that I understand in how I do my work, and also how I serve community in the work that I do. And I think also in acknowledging Indigenous territories, I also think that it's important to talk about the histories of enslavement as well that exist in Canada that isn't often mentioned as well, and to talk also about the ways in which my work can be connected to Black liberation. So I'll just leave it at that because I'm sure we'll talk more about it.
I can go next. Vanessa, do you want to go? Good, okay. As Anushka mentioned, we grew up in the same town. I also grew up on Tsawwassen territory, and can certainly relate to the experience of Indigenous history and Indigenous context and community being made pretty invisible in my upbringing and my life. I recall my first girlfriend, actually, you know, after I graduated from high school, you know, was the person to teach me about residential schools. And so kind of there began, I think, like the ideology and the values of equity and inclusion and social justice were always very much like at the core of my upbringing in my family. But I think all of us, all of the members of my immediate family kind of began probably our journey around approximately the same time of beginning to sort of do that work and learn that history. So yeah, both my parents were born in colonial Canada. I believe, I know like painfully little about my ancestry. I know that my grandparents on both sides were, I believe, all four of them were second generation Canadian, and their parents came from British and Irish ancestry mostly. And my main sort of like conduit to that knowledge and history is my grandmother, who passed away right before the pandemic hit, and she was just such a rich source of knowledge and important learning around this stuff, and had been involved in like Indigenous liberation efforts in Calgary from like the 60s. So I really wish she was still around so that I could keep learning from her. But actually, she's behind me on the wall, so I'll leave it at that. But yeah, Grammy's with me always. Thanks.
Hey, yeah. So yeah, where do I start? I was born in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is the traditional territories of the BFIC. And I am the daughter of Chinese immigrants to this country. I won't say too much. I think we'll talk more about this, but certainly the foundations of how I think about being in the world and moving into a future we can all share, and also creating systems that can take care of all of us, are based in ideas of change. And for me, thinking through what systems change looks like and what alterity looks like is very much based in Indigenous worldview, and what we can learn from knowledge and practices and relational respect that comes from the land we're on and from the people who've been here for millennia. So, yeah, it's a critical way of, I think, surviving for all of us. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess I'll go. I'm the last one. I'm a 1.5 generation Filipinx settler to these lands. My my family actually moved from the Philippines to Burnaby in 2005, and then after that we moved to the northeast part of Calgary, which I believe is Treaty 7 territories. And then in 2012 I moved back to Vancouver on my own to go to Langara. Yeah, I guess like I went to Langara to learn. I was a part of the women's studies program there, where I like learned a lot, I guess, about, you know, a lot of things that we're talking about today, including like Indigenous history on this land. I like learned very little about like, yeah, like the, you know, the genocide and like the ongoing colonialism on this land. I learned a little bit in elementary school. Thankfully, like I had like one social studies teacher who like, I don't think any other teacher did it at like my junior high in Calgary. I think, I can't remember his name. He was like a South Asian man who like, yeah, actually took the time to teach us about Canada being not all it's cracked up to be. And yeah, I don't know, I guess I'm still learning a lot in general. I don't know. We'll talk more about everything today. That's it.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate everything you shared so far, and I guess we'll just dive in. My first question is, what was the first queer-owned or operated or populated space you remember walking into, and how did it feel to be in that space? And then you know, you can go into the journey from there of how queer spaces have continued to be so integral to your life and to your work. I'd love to hear those stories.
The first queer populated space I remember entering was Sonar, which I think eventually became Rain, but it was something in between, and I forget what that was. But it was like at a time when the L Word was very popular. It was probably around like season 2 or 3 or something. And I had seen drag shows on TV, and I walked into this bar, and DKU, Drag Kings United, were performing like at the moment that I entered. And it was just like a totally unfamiliar and like exhilarating moment.
My first one was actually at UVic, the Women's Studies reading room. Back then it was called Women's Studies, and I think they've since changed the department name. And I remember going into that study room for the first time, and there being a cup where we had like a shared membership for Crashpad, which was a queer porn site. And it was like a cup, and you would put a toonie or a loonie or whatever, and it had the username and the password. And it was just such a great point of community. And we would do a lot of eating there. And it was actually such a beautiful way of like putting together everything that we were learning. And then from there, not just keeping it in our heads, but finding ways to put it back into the way that we do organizing and the ways that we understood friendship, understood chosen family.
I love that. I love a mutual Crashpad membership.
That is a truly valuable thing. I think the first place I was thinking this over earlier, and I was like, oh, I can't remember really very well, but I think it was actually when I was a teenager and I went to Celebrities for the first time, and I wasn't out really yet, but I was with my friend who was like super everything curious. And so we went, and I remember thinking like, I was like, what have I done? Like I was wearing the most absurd outfit because I was really trying to like make it work. I just remember thinking like deep awkward. It was not a good night, but it was a memorable one.
I think like one of the first queer spaces that I remember walking into. This was like when I moved to Vancouver and I was still like a baby queer. So like my vague perception of Commercial Drive in general was just like, everyone is queer here. But I would also like echo what Melanie said, like, as I also went to women's studies at Langara, and yeah, I think Langara officially was like the women's studies program there was like my first official queer space. I'm pretty sure my my instructors there were queer as well, or at least one of them. I can't remember her name right now. I think some of you might actually know her. Nancy. I can't remember her last name, but she's like the best prof at Langara, and like really like made things comfortable for me, like especially like being new to Vancouver. So I think I've also been to I never went to Rhizome when it was a thing. I never went to like Purple Thistle. I think right around the time I like started to like go out of the house more beyond like going on Craigslist dates. I think that was like the time that like Harper like nixed the funding on the arts programs like for Purple Thistle, I think. But yeah, Langara and my prof Nancy's class.
Yeah, I can echo university being a place where it like finally all clicked in, especially growing up in a pretty Christian, small-ish town. But I think by accident and in retrospect, probably one of the first queer spaces that I was in that was like kind of dominantly queer would have been, and maybe Paige can echo this, would have been my high school theater classes. There's something in the water in our hometown where literally like so many people.
It's known. It's in the water. It's the ladder legends. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so many people came out, you know, directly after graduating almost. So I think inadvertently I dipped my toe into queer community without knowing it, probably without any of us knowing it, and probably with a lot of us feeling pretty scared about that realization sort of bubbling away in the back of your brain and heart. Yeah, that maybe would have been the first one where, yeah, musical theater, which like duh. Yeah. Yeah, are there other queer spaces that you can think of in the history of being in Vancouver specifically that were incredibly important to you? I mean, I can really think of Rhizome and Heartwood as one of those spaces, a space I dearly miss to this day. I think about like Lick and Lotus and you know, that building, which, you know, like those spaces really no longer exist, like women or like queer women centered party spaces. Yeah, are there any other spots in the history of your time in Vancouver that you can think of that people should know about, that they existed or that they still exist?
Definitely Redgate in all its many iterations, because there were many iterations, I think, that have existed, and that many queer dance parties have definitely followed. And I think also, and I also want to mention too, like thinking about like the other parties that existed there, like Gen Party Mothers parties. I'm not sure because it was before my time of being back in Vancouver, but I think maybe Bent and Prance were also there. And then also thinking about Gallery Gachet and the amount of amazing things that they did in terms of holding space for specifically BIPOCs, QT BIPOCs. When me and my friends created QT Apocalypse, which is a BIPOC collective in 2012, before it was cool to, to support BIPOC only spaces, which we'll talk about maybe in a couple minutes. They were amazing supporters. And also I would maybe say, what was the corner of Venables and Commercial? Astorinos also. That was also some really great parties there. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to shout out some. Sorry, go ahead, Mel. No.
Oh no, I also wanted to say too that like I know that oftentimes it's easy to focus on like the dance spaces too, but there are also other spaces as well, like bookstores and like all these other things that I think don't often get the shout outs as well.
I was just going to mention, you remind me of some of the other like decentralized events that would sort of like roam around in the absence of like a suitable permanent home, or in some cases, I'm sure like intentionally, politically, you know, with the desire to sort of like, you know, venture around the city into different pop-up spaces. So like I'm thinking about the some of the like halls that I think like Fuck Off and Dance, you know, happened at. Like, I don't even remember which ones, to be honest. It was that long ago, but Spit and yeah, some of the, like the Anza Club, Wise Hall, Cafe de.
I just want to give my props to the Powell Street Festival as being the place that I have always found queer community. It's not an explicitly queer organization, but it's always been, yeah, that's Pride weekend for me, more so than the Dyke March or the Pride March. Or yeah, that's where I go to feel comfortable. And it's always been an incredible place for kind of intersectional politics, and the intersection of art and activism and gender and sexuality has always been part of that conversation as well. And I also want to say, like, in terms of like kink and sex positive spaces, there's been a number of really incredible organizers over the course of many years that have kept those things going. And I want to say, yeah, there's like a bunch of different collectives that I think have put a lot of work into some really incredible play spaces over time. And most recently, I want to acknowledge Swallow Your Pride, and that group of people have been putting on really good parties and making a real effort to make sure that they're accessible and that they're, yeah.
I wanted to say at some point in this panel that I feel like obviously any space that I walk into is going to be a queer space. That's like just like something that I always say. But when Denim Fest was around, and like I think the Cutie Apocalypse Collective, I never went to any of those events, but because I'm just like a person. I'm a Filipino person who can't dance, but I don't know. I just wanted to say that I always appreciated those spaces existing, even though like I was far too shy to go to them. So yeah.
We specifically organized Denim Fest for shy people.
It's true, you had that like quiet room where people could just like sit and hang out. Where I never went. Yeah, I would also say that like bookstores were so important to me when I first started living in the city. So like somewhere like Little Sisters, or even just like secondhand bookstores like Pulp Fiction, or the one on the Drive whose name is escaping me right now.
People's Co-op.
Yes, the People's Co-op bookstore. Yeah, spaces like that always had either events that were organized around some kind of queer literary experience, or carried a lot of like queer literary content, which was, you know, I didn't know where to look for it. And so to know like that those spaces existed were also like so incredibly important to me, because we need to be able to like read and see stories that reflect some element of our own experience. And you know, there's a reason we're talking about queer space after a screening of Circus of Books, because yeah, those places are also gathering and community building spaces as well. And yes, we love a good dance party, but we don't always, although now I would like donate all my organs for a good dance party, but you know, it's so awesome to have like a plethora of different kinds of spaces that you can go to as a queer person that represent like the diversity of what you want to find and the kind of community that you want to connect to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We would also be remiss to not mention Eastside Studios and Clubhouse. Duh. Just needed to say that out loud. I know we were reminiscing about past things, but I think it's really, really important to talk about also the many spaces that you, Paige, have created in terms of, yeah, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks.
No problem.
So when and how did you all begin to carve out this idea of creating queer space in your own careers? And when I say career, you know, like, I mean, like any kind of organizing that you've done, because you all work towards gathering people together and creating an environment where people can express themselves, maybe see some like hilarious comedy, some beautiful art, some incredible performance, have critical conversations, all these kinds of things. Yeah, when did that kind of drive to do that start to propel you to create those spaces?
My organizing actually started first with creating BIPOC spaces when I was in Victoria. And so in that way, I felt like anything that I was doing was kind of like queering in a way, spaces that I think a lot of people were used to. And I remember getting a lot of pushback from that way back in the day. And so I think the idea of kind of like creating spaces for queers kind of just felt kind of very second nature, because so much of, I think, the work that I do is kind of like, how do we, who aren't usually given spaces, and how can we create platforms for them? And also, how can we have that engagement? What is an engagement with power? And I think oftentimes that looks like the idea of like, yeah, creating spaces that are based on community determined access and needs. And so I think, yeah, I think the other thing too is that like, I was born always knowing that I was super big homo. And so, and also being Filipino and growing up Catholic, you don't ever really talk about that. But then when you kind of like leave the family household, it's like, yes, I can finally talk about that. And so there was something about it that felt really kind of like, I don't know, I know it doesn't really make sense, but it makes a lot of sense in my head to just be all like, everything that I do is based on the idea of creating these spaces that always kind of felt like we weren't allowed to say them out loud. But now I'm going to say it out loud, and I'm going to just make it my life's work.
I can jump in quickly, I guess. Yeah, you know, I think I come to this maybe a little bit, yeah, how would I say, I get, you know, the first time I thought about queer space and creating queer space through what I was doing was when I started working at the Queer Film Festival. And so I think I was director of programming there in 2006 to 2008. So it was quite some time ago. And at that point, I think it was the first time I had thought about my own role in creating spaces that queer people would gather under. And it was a profoundly uncomfortable role actually for me, because I come to this as someone who's like, because of my life experience, I've always been someone who's like, okay, well, I'm gonna like not rock the boat, and I'm just gonna try and like do my own thing, but not, you know, be super visible while I do it. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm part of this queer organization, and I'm sort of tasked with creating content that people are gonna find, you know, either uplifting or validating or meaningful. Or troubling or whatever, but like creating this like, I think it was just really important for me at that point to create complexity out of what we thought queerness was. And at that time, you know, I mean, I think that the landscape has changed hugely, but at that time, it was really about like the validating queer expressions in film were often romantic comedies. Like that was often what people really wanted to see, to feel like a sense of happiness. And I don't fault that at all. It's like, that's what people needed. And so I guess for me, what I wanted to see was yeah, more nuance, an increase of nuance, a yes and, like yes romance, yes validation, but also like experimental film, and also foreign film, like foreign language film. And so it was really important to me that the opening and closing galas were foreign language instead of sort of North American productions, and things like that, just because for me it just felt like we are such a broad community. We should be representing like so many different parts of this human experience. And yeah, that was my first foray, and that was really formative for me, and it kind of helped me along in sort of discovering what I think my own role is in this question of queer space.
So I wasn't in high school, like I wasn't a queer. I didn't like, I wasn't a, what am I trying to say? I'm not a drama queer. Like I didn't take drama class in high school. So like, I didn't really come into my own and like, as a performer until like, the Frank Theater put on Telling It Bent, which was a weekly writing table, like where I think for over a month it was an all queer group. Half of us were BIPOC, and yeah, we like shared our poetry with each other, like shared our life experiences with each other in like a random room in Telus Garden, because like that's that was one of the people who worked there like volunteered up their space. And then everything that we did in the month and a half that we did Telling It Bent culminated in a performance at the Culture. So like that was literally my first time like performing anything on stage. So like that kind of really like jump started, yeah, like my start as a performer. And then yeah, in 2018 I like really came into being more of a comedian, kind of with the mentorship of Jackie Hoffart, who runs a comedy show that used to be called Foxhole Comedy at the projection room above the Fox Cabaret. It's now called New Moon Comedy. And she like really encouraged me to like kind of start a space within like Vancouver, like within the Vancouver comedy scene. That Savannah Erasmus and I, like we produce and host Millennial Line together, and we like didn't really necessarily feel totally welcome at most of the comedy shows that like already existed in Vancouver. Like they can say that their events are like queer friendly or whatever, but like yeah, I guess I'm like kind of speaking mostly today like in my role in the Vancouver comedy scene, because I don't know if people are super aware of it, you know. But yeah, like I think people know when you're making a concerted effort to like make queer people, like especially like queer people of color, like welcome in a space. Like yeah, you can say like your lineups are diverse or queer friendly or whatever, but like when people aren't really looking you in the eye, I don't know, that's like kind of when I felt like Savannah and I had to start and like kind of assert ourselves in the scene, you know, like this is like who we were like as both yeah, like queer comedians in Vancouver. So yeah, it was important for us to start our show. I can't remember what I was where I was getting at with that, but yeah, that's kind of basically my journey. As I feel like I'm first and foremost like a comedian more than I am like a comedy producer. Mostly because I'm coming from a place where I was like working full time and all this. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, you got it. Paige, anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to just add that like queer mentorship was so you know, critical to my growth as an organizer. And like my first drag experience started as just me wanting to like have my birthday party at Lick. And it, you know, the bar manager who hired me because I was bartending at the time connected me with a local drag king and was like, why don't you book a drag show? And then they ended up daring me to perform, and they became my drag dad. Like it was just that it began there. And then thereafter, kind of like over the years, it was queer community members who provided me I want to almost say exclusively, but with the shout out to my family that, raised me and everything, but like almost exclusively was responsible for my growth and education, around the, privilege that I held as like a, white queer person organizing events and performing on stages, and, the many different intersections and representation of folks that were missing for the first like many years of my organizing career. So yeah, that's just like such a central, I think, component of like a resilient queer community, is that like community support and care that goes into, raising organizers and letting folks fall down and get back up.
Yeah, that's such an important point. That mentorship that can be made available to us, which for a lot of queer folks, and for a lot of queer folks of color especially, like that's very hard to find. And a space is like an actual physical space that you can go to often can act like a mentor in a way. Like it can build you up, and you can learn so much from being in a space or from organizing in the space. And I guess the next question I would ask is, what are some of the intersections that you've had to navigate as an organizer in spaces that are both, queer owned, quote unquote, or owned by allied folks that host queer events? What are some of the challenges and successes that you've had in organizing in those spaces? And what are some of the considerations around representation and visibility and accessibility that you've had to think about over the years? VQFF, we have an office, but we don't have a home necessarily. And sometimes that can feel like a loss, especially with queer spaces disappearing so quickly in the city, and how unaffordable venues are to rent, even for a larger organization like us. So yeah, what are some of the challenges and successes you found with being somebody who holds space but also has to negotiate space?
Paige, you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go. Definitely. So also just to name the cobalt as a very like relevant and important, addition to our like list that we were building. Hosted Man Up and me as an organizer and participant in queer community for, the majority of my life as an organizer and the majority of like Man Up's history and many other queer events. And it was kind of a magical unicorn in the way that it managed to facilitate and like house events for so many different communities, and certainly not without its faults. But I think having, the challenges were, of course, like, political differences or hiccups we would kind of like, come across with trying to communicate certain priorities to the owners. But for the most part, almost like, across the board, I would say like their support was just kind of was a given. And when, a community member came forward and said, we need to have some sort of like a community support function of some kind at events, was sort of the birth of the buddy system. And, we talked to the owners of the Cobalt, and so just to speak to like the lessons or like opportunities that can come from challenges like that, because it literally was born from like an incident of sexual violence, like after an amateur hour event at the Cobalt. And so communicating, like identifying the sort of benefit to the owners and the need, for the community at large, and, and the opportunity for them if they were to support it was, I think, really helpful in mobilizing them to, get behind us. And not to say it really took much convincing, like they were, totally on board and supportive from the beginning. But yeah, I think when it does come to, finding that there are priorities that you and your community have, but that the proprietors don't necessarily have, trying to find some, you know, common ground and common opportunity. And usually there is an advantage to the space as well, and not just to your event. So if it comes to like, you know, prioritizing like, you know, BIPOC entry, or like having accessible pricing and that kind of thing, like there's usually a benefit to the owners that they just don't see yet. It's not that it doesn't exist. So that worked for us, you know, in some instances for sure.
I can speak on behalf of my experiences with Heartwood specifically, because we're obviously a brick and mortar space that succeeded Rhizome. And the organization that actually ended up kind of swooping in after Rhizome decided to close was actually the United Church, or a particular branch of the United Church. And this branch, all amazing human beings, to be honest with you. They were all predominantly white, and also all queer. And I think that in the beginning, I think it was a little rocky, just kind of thinking of like, oh, what does it mean to be working with a church? But then also knowing that the folks we were working with had a massive decades of like histories in migrant justice and anti-mining, which was really, really heartening to know. And to be honest with you, one of the hardest things about Heartwood was actually being a functioning business, and knowing that first and foremost, what we actually wanted to do was create a queer space. But we wanted to create a queer space that was going to be supported by something that was just as unsustainable in terms of capitalist structures, which was a restaurant cafe. And particularly like in Vancouver and also just generally Canada, I was actually looking at the failure rates for new businesses, which is actually 78%. And so knowing that we were a new business and then also a restaurant, which has a higher failure rate, it was interesting to figure out how to navigate through that space. And I think the other thing too was that the space was relatively old as well. And it seems weird to understand it as a constraint, but one of the things that was actually really hard for us was was the fact that actually we didn't have enough washrooms. And I know that that's really weird, but when you don't have enough washrooms, it means that your capacity is limited. And when your capacity is limited, for us, that meant that in understanding what it meant to be financially accessible, to have a menu that was financially accessible, we needed to figure out a price point that would be able to match the amount of people that could be in the room at one time, which was unfortunately limited to the actual structure of the building. And so what ended up being kind of like a weird relationship with us was actually just all these different bylaws with the city and the types of legalities we had to navigate around, thinking about what it meant in terms of what type of license we needed to be able to do the type of events we wanted to do, what it meant based on the type of zoning we had as well. We had residents that were living upstairs, so it also meant that there was a cap in the amount of, in how long we could do events. Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, it became really hard. And I think that was what ended up being the demise of the space. But the people of Heartwood were amazing. And I do want to give a shout out to the folks that were there, because I think oftentimes people, oftentimes in these spaces, single people can be kind of institutionalized, which I think is a really, really unfortunate and awkward thing in queer organizing. But I do want to give a shout out to Annalise Gabon and also Ainsley Hastings and Anita Sparrow for the amazing work that they did. And then also for Denim Fest, I also want to give a shout out to Emily Groundwater. I think all of the people who are part of these spaces, they don't work in isolation. And sometimes it's quite awkward being kind of like the solo person being the voice for it, so.
Vanessa and Tin?
I'm good. I feel like we have a few more questions to go through, so I feel okay to pass on that one.
Yeah, I'll pass as well.
Okay. So in terms of creating a space that is that could be sustainable and accessible for queer community, what would be what are the ideal things that you would look for, and what are some of the challenges that you come up against? I think Mel, you spoke really well about having to negotiate with like city bylaws and like the physical outlay of a space. But yeah, how do you go about finding space in the city that is so inaccessible in so many ways? How do you even begin?
I could speak about Grunt Gallery a little bit. It's a bit of an unusual situation because I think it's in a different kind of position than a lot of queer organizing that has to kind of take over different kinds of spaces. But Grunt is an artist-run center, and it's been around since 1984. So it's quite I guess it's a very established center at this point in the city. And it's also, we own our space, and it was bought in the early 90s. The space that we're at now at 2nd and Scotia, or 2nd and oh my God, anyway, 2nd and over there, is a space that we've been incredibly privileged to have for the last 20-something years. And so I'll just say a little bit about how that space has come along, and maybe it's kind of a unique queer space in the city in that it's not exclusively queer, but it was formed with the original collective of artists as a place that was challenging the established values of the contemporary art scene at the time. And so it became a place that was open to outsider artists, and many of those artists were queer. And so in the early days, there was drag shows, and there was just a lot of people felt a certain amount of ownership of that space. And over time, that kind of like impression of what isn't being represented in the art community has shifted and changed. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about Grunt. It's one of the reasons that I remain really attached and invested in that place, is because queerness has always been part of that, and it's always been allowed to evolve. And so one of the things that my predecessor, Glenn Alteen, who was the founding director, and he just retired last year, he had the foresight to think about the institution as a place that held space, and that if he was able to, he made a deal with a developer in the 90s. And at that time, that was a really uncool thing to do. And a lot of people are like, Grunt is totally sold out. And, you know, to some degree, I guess that's true. But actually, Glenn and his wisdom and the folks that were at the gallery at that time were like, no, this is a place that if we can buy it, then it exists. And we get to keep doing the work that we do. And so over time, we've been able to leverage that to create other kinds of spaces. So I think this idea of capital and what you do with your capital and is like so integral to how we think of the future and how we think of like creating spaces that can sustain and support alternative vision, of which queerness is a part, is also about like understanding that the absolute need in this city to be able to own your own space and have it. And it's allowed us to do things like leverage that stability into things like public art projects or artist residencies that we've kind of expanded as capital projects, and also to keep and hold a mandate to expand what that alternative vision looks like. So it once might have been queerness, but also now I think one of our focuses is trying to figure out those points at which we intersect with Indigenous queer communities, with Black queer communities, and with all kinds of different visions of what queerness looks like. So I think it's just a work in progress, but I have to say that original investment in capital has been hugely important for us, especially in the city.
Yeah, I'd love to hear other folks' thoughts. And I know, Paige, you know, your own team has had to negotiate with the idea of ownership and rental as well. Yeah, how incredibly important is it to have ownership over like a physical space that's yours, that, you know, can't be taken away from you? And maybe like what are some of the complexities and troubling of owning space on unceded territory, which Vanessa's already like touched touched on a bit.
Yeah, thanks. So we rent the spaces that we're in, but being the leaseholders gives us, as along with the incredible financial burden and risk involved and responsibility, there's an incredible sort of agency that we are afforded that I had never experienced in my years of queer space making in the past. So one of the things that worked really well for us was sort of, and was a model that we sort of followed from folks that we had seen in, not queer folks, but in the sort of local hospitality industry, and like a former boss of mine, for example, was this diversified model of having art studios and an event space. So I mean, that was what a big part of why we didn't completely crumble and go bankrupt in the pandemic, is we still had artists that fortunately didn't all just move out and were paying at least some of the rent on the buildings. And it one of the most, beautiful things that enabled this sort of power that we had to sort of do with the space what we wanted, and not compete with, I don't know what mentioning names, but just your standard issue straight parties at East Van venues for weekend spots, for example, and stuff like that. Enabled us to welcome and house the inception of Level Up, a Black queer dance party, and some other QT BIPOC focused events, and stuff that kind of may be more difficult to sell to a venue owner elsewhere in the city. But yeah, it's definitely a complicated but really important question, thinking about having that kind of power over the use of space. And even when it comes to implementing certain safer space policies, or zero tolerance policies for certain behaviors in your space, much as we were in endeavoring to do that and establish policies that would protect vulnerable people who are attending the space, was also I think landed for some folks, particularly because we are white organizers, at least those of us who have the space are the white organizers. Those event organizers are not white, but was sort of exercising a power over who had access and who couldn't, even if it was coming from a place of endeavoring to have the space be safe. Those are still questions that we're asking, and a sort of at least interim solution or strategy that we had was to apply for grant funding, because the investment of labor and resources to sort of do this community consultation around what does it really mean in practice at a party to say that a culturally appropriative hairstyle is not something that will be welcomed into the space, and what does that actually look like in practice in terms of who should be approaching that person, what sort of education or cultural identity ought they to have, and how are they going to be paid for that labor and all this stuff. So it was cool. The city of Vancouver granted us some money to sort of do some of that work, and we're sort of doing that through the pandemic to hopefully be better set up when events come back. And just I'll add to that too, we were able to get that money because we formed a nonprofit. So that was also something that enabled us to access funds that we wouldn't have otherwise. So yeah, I hope that speaks to the question. But yeah, full of challenges, and I think something that we're still kind of lifelong learning, but certainly current present day learning, is how land back movements are needing to be so centered in the work that we're all doing, but especially those of us who are white or non-Indigenous, and yeah, centering the needs and voices of Indigenous folks first and foremost, because of the land that we're on, and how can we come from a decolonial lens to develop these practices and policies for safer spaces. So we're just babies in that learning, really. And yeah, thanks so much to the community members who've contributed to that process.
Tin, in your experiences in being in spaces that aren't necessarily queer owned and not necessarily populated with majority queer folks in the comedy scene, what are some of the experiences that you've had that have made spaces safer for you as a performer or as an organizer for other performers? And yeah, what would you consider as like some of the I guess benchmarks for safety in a space that isn't necessarily queer but is like being queered? I'd love to know.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if people are aware, but like stand-up comedy isn't recognized as like officially as an art in Canada. Like, so I can't get any Canada Council grants, you know, for anything kind of related to stand-up comedy, which is funny because I've kind of like by design, Millennial Line is poetry and stand-up, so we can kind of sneak in through that way. But I've always kind of deferred to like the folks at Redgate for like I mean I trust the folks at Redgate to kind of like keep the space safe, you know, like I've gotten a couple of requests, like, you know, from like guests on the show, like if there's someone that they don't want or someone they don't like feel safe around, to like not be a, you know, don't come in. We've always done things like for people who are low income, you know, to like not pay for the show at all, or like kind of be on a sliding scale. But yeah, like I really can't like kind of speak to like queer spaces, like and like creating queer spaces from like more from the financial or like bureaucratic point of view, because yeah, I don't know, it's just kind of like it's not been my experience, I guess. I've kind of forgot your question as well.
No, that's okay. I was just saying, like, as someone who performs in those spaces or brings other performers into those spaces, what are some of the things that like you've noticed have been really amazing about being in those spaces or really problematic about being in those spaces?
Yeah, I was talking about Redgate, but basically like I'm glad that I kind of don't have to host the show at a bar or a restaurant where I wouldn't have like the same support, like tech or like otherwise, that I would have gone at Redgate. So for that, I'm like actually thankful. Like I know those folks like have meetings when it comes to like the like safety and like inclusion of everyone coming into that space.
Thank you. I guess the next question I would have is, what do you think is the future for queer establishments in this city that like are actual like physical owned spaces, given what's going on with COVID and our inevitable continued reliance on digital programming? What do you see in the future for physical gathering spaces that are queer owned and operated, or at the very least owned and operated by folks who love us and want to be by our side as we continue to do the work we do? Yeah, how do you see that sort of like that digital, I'm very invested in this conversation, of course, as an organizer, and I'm sure you all are. How do you see that digital and that physical working alongside each other? And of course, it's okay if you don't have the answer, because I certainly don't, and I'm having an existential crisis about it every single day.
Maybe I'll go first in case I have to run before the meeting totally wraps, because I have another meeting. I'm so sorry to be leaving early. This has been awesome. One thing that certainly I didn't create this idea, but that I've heard people talking about is so sort of like cool and surprising, maybe, about the pandemic forcing us all into digital space experiences, is the ways that format could be carried forward to times when we will eventually be able to gather in physical space together again, and not only open up that kind of experience, say through a virtual stream or whatever, to you know, people in other parts of the world or whatever, but for people who, you know, can't or don't wish to leave their homes, but, you know, want to kind of participate in some way. So that is sort of like, you know, a like thread of like a, you know, future that like that I'm really inspired by, because again, just speaking to some of the like, you know, structural like prohibitively expensive, you know, modifications to space to create physical accessibility for folks. It's so challenging. It's so challenging to make spaces really work. And I commend the city for sort of like in the last like few years, like that I've been sort of paying closer attention. There's definitely, I think thanks to the work of like activists, and I think Mel, actually you were on an advisory committee with the city, and I see like shadows of your work in the like literature that I'm like reading around like the, you know, priorities that you know, the city is setting out around like access and equity and centering marginalized experiences and stuff. So yeah, it's been good to see you know, increased funding available for that kind of work. And so yeah, I hope that like that it will be something that comes from, you know, a so-called post-pandemic world.
Less so digital, but I think the idea of what Paige was talking about earlier around diversification of space, I think is going to be really important in terms of figuring out how to just generally survive with one another, but then also how to innovate space with each other, I think is going to be really important, especially I think with Vancouver and just us being very known for being very dense. And in that also with that density, knowing that that's also really linked to a really high rate of turnover that's deeply linked to gentrification. So trying to figure out how we can kind of like innovate with each other as queer communities around how we can survive during these really hard times in keeping up our brick and mortar spaces. Sorry, I don't understand digital spaces. Got no answers for you.
I'm on the same page as you. I think one of the things that I'll just speak from my own experience, one of the things that we thought would maybe like become easier in the pandemic, and we'll say goodbye and thank you to Paige, who had to jump off to another meeting. Super grateful for everything they shared. Yeah, is that somehow delivering digitally would increase accessibility to artistic engagement, but that's not necessarily true, because the same barriers that exist for a lot of folks in physical spaces also exist in digital spaces when it comes to captioning or audio transcription or digital literacy, access to technology, all of these things. So I think that was one of the misconceptions I personally encountered as an organizer doing digital work during COVID. Yeah, so just wanted to like add that point in there as well. But yeah, Vanessa, Tin, what are your thoughts on how are we going to do this moving forward? And the world seems to also be like maybe shifting for the better. Ooh, I don't know. It's like we're on the edge of a knife. It could either go real bad or maybe start edging towards something less terrible. But yeah, is there like what kinds of positive and empowering futures can we create ourselves to make sure that we have space and that we can claim space and continue to create space for each other?
I feel like live streams have been great for people who like, you know, can't easily physically access space, you know. I've been a part of a bunch of like online shows, like comedy or otherwise, like panels like this. It's easier, you know, to like connect internationally and like not just like on the like local realm of things. And like even like like perceiving like local communities like broken down as like not just local, you know, like we're kind of like online, we're finding community like across borders and connecting to like queer and trans artists elsewhere. I don't know, like as a queer who've always I've always kind of depended on the internet to like meet other queer people. Like before I moved out to Vancouver from Calgary, like I've always been online. So yeah, I mean, I understand that like not everyone has access to technology, but like I feel like the future of like queer spaces like really need to take into account like, yeah, like not everyone's gonna be tech like literally, or what am I saying, like literate like in technology. Like I feel like we need to keep that in mind too, like right now like performers online have to be their own tech person, you know, like if we're going to be working from home, like how are we going to find or like want to put in time to like set up a digital space or show or even like a panel like this. I was going to be a part of like what was going to be an important discussion with other Filipino queers, and it didn't happen. But like one of the things that we were talking about when we were still organizing it was like for the queer youth who are going to be a part of it, you know, like it was important to keep in mind like what if they're not out at home, or if it's not safe for them to be at home and like kind of accessing this digital space. And yeah, like for queer elders as well, like if they don't know how to access technology, that's something else to keep in mind. But I don't know, I feel like digital space, like even after COVID, is something that should be easier to access. So yeah.
I have a couple of big hopes, I guess. Some of them are around digital and some of them around actual physical space creation. And I guess maybe the first thing that I hope for is like COVID in the last many months and all the things that have happened has done a few things. One, it's shown all of us how disproportionately affected people are by things like public health emergencies. And also, it has also shown how things can really be mobilized, resources can be mobilized really quickly when it's necessary. And three, there's a lot of interest in finding new ways of doing things. And I think I do have a lot of hope actually that there are new forms of ownership and stewardship that we might be able to draw on in the future. And I think there are things around shared cultural assets that are very possible within some of the frameworks that we have. I know it often moves very slowly at the city, but I think that there is a will and an interest to figure out how to do this a little differently, because I think we've been shown how difficult it is. And when people are vulnerable, then it really is, something like COVID can be absolutely devastating for some people. And I think there is like a real interest in coalition building right now. And I think it's also a very difficult time, so these things will take time. But yeah, I do have a lot of hope there around what kind of productive partnerships can come out of this moment. And in terms of the digital, I mean, for us at Grunt, I mean, I share your trepidation, Anushka, around like the real possibilities of increased accessibility through the digital universe. But I think for us, we've just really tried to take one thing on as a thing that we're going to do as a baseline standard, and that's captioning for all of our materials. And that's something that, because we were making the pivot anyway to digital, it's just one more detail to add. And we've been lucky enough to work with Kay Slater, who is an accessibility consultant, but also has done some work with Queer ASL, and is also works with Grunt as a contractor on a regular basis. And they've been really incredible in kind of just helping us figure out the mechanics of that. And that's been something that has given me a ton of hope in the last little bit. It's like, there is stuff that we can do. There is a measurable difference that we can make. And then we just kind of like inch that door just a little bit more open every time we just try and make this something that is just a matter of course. So for me, I mean, that's what I'm holding on to right now, is like the capacity to actually make these measurable shifts, and to involve the community in co-learning too. Like if there's other people that want to learn this technology, then we will open that door and create captioning workshops so that it's just something that moves along through the community, and that's our plan and that's our hope. So yeah, that's my mini hopeful things.
Mel, did you have anything to add?
Could you see my finger just almost pressing unmute? You know me. Well, no, I was just kind of thinking about like the fact that, you know, like even in physical spaces, we are met with a lot of barriers, and part of our work as queer organizers is trying to figure out how we can reduce or eliminate those barriers. And I think the same goes with whatever new venues we're using, you know. And for I guess for this instance, in terms of digital, we have to think about, yeah, if there is kind of like a financial barrier, or if there's whatever types of barriers like that exist, those are just some things that we need to keep on figuring out what we need to do, you know, what we need to do better, what we need to look into further.
Yeah, that's a really important note. And sometimes those barriers are not all, like barriers to accessing are also representational as well, like who's being represented in the space, who has a voice in the space, whose voices are being uplifted, and the challenges of supporting that in solidarity, and also negotiating the power shifts in terms of like who's had access to space and who's had access to be able to like speak and represent themselves as well. And I think that has also been a huge, I mean, if you're, you know, a queer person of color, as we, you know, all are here, we've been aware of those barriers since probably day, you know, one of birth. But yeah, there's that cultural shift as well also is creates a difference in who accesses which spaces and who feels welcome in which spaces as well. And that's definitely something that we're contending with over here as well, in terms of curation and whose voices are being uplifted and whose voices have a history of being completely underrepresented or misrepresented. And that is a huge part of queer community as well. And yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying, Vanessa, about programming for VQFF and the curse of the why aren't there enough queer rom-coms, and yeah, just thinking about how we relate to space as well as queer people, and what we and our various feelings of how we should have access to space, and that being another negotiation when you're an organizer, is, you know, who has been entitled to space for hundreds of years and who has not been able to carve out any space for hundreds of years. So maybe I would end the conversation on that note. What are some of the like beautiful things that you've seen come out of this pandemic that have that have given you feelings of joy and hope, in absence of being able to gather together and have that collective empathetic experience, which I deeply miss, for one. No one has anything. We're all depressed. There's pandemic depression, seasonal depression, regular depression.
I guess one thing that I've been grateful for and that I feel privileged to be able to experience is a feeling of rest right now, amid the very low hum of deep anxiety that is constantly there. It's like, what is this cough? But yeah, to give myself some time to kind of like reflect, especially over the years around my years of queer organizing, what it all meant, because I think oftentimes I can get it all happened so quickly, and then all of a sudden you're here and you're all like, oh, I feel like I've retired doing that, and I haven't given myself enough chances to celebrate all the great parties that I've thrown and all the really great people that I've met.
That's really nice.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this last little bit has really clarified for me who I want to spend time with, who I am accountable to, and where I want to put my energy. And so for me, that's like probably the biggest, glimmer of hope, I think, is that it just allows us to know with greater certainty where we want to go. So I think that's really valuable.
This is the first time in like years that like since I was a child that I haven't worked. Like I'm just sitting on my ass like collecting EI. So that's been nice. That's really all I had to say, really. In addition to like Mel was talking about the low hum of anxiety, there's that, and also the low hum of the recently acquired air purifier to kind of quell my anxiety of, do I have COVID or am I just anxious? Yeah.
Yes, there's so many different things that are sort of at our like in our attention span. So it can be hard to focus on those things that are super meaningful. And I appreciate that you all had an answer that was like grounded in the present, and in rest and in reflection and in like, yeah, I really appreciate that because I'm bad at that. Personally. I love the future.
What if you're like, no, I threw everything in a volcano,
including myself? Yeah, so on that up note, though, I would really like to thank you all so much for sharing all of your thoughts here today. It would have been so nice to sit in a room with all of you, but we have this virtual room, and that's enough for now. And thank you all for all of the work that you've done, and are going to continue to do and are doing now, to make this city a safer, more vibrant, more fun and exciting and weird and questioning and challenging space, in all of the ways that you're doing that. Truly appreciate it. I hope that the folks who watch this get something really beautiful out of it. I certainly have. And yeah, just want to really appreciate you all and give you a round of applause. That's just me because we don't have a real audience right now. But thank you so much. I'm incredibly grateful.
Thank you so much, Anushka.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.